All right, welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're gonna look at Unit 2.3, Indian Ocean, and there's a lot of different angles that you are expected to kind of understand from this. But we've already kind of covered this in Unit 1 a lot, so we're just gonna go through and do this. Our skill practice today, we're gonna start our daily 5 with sourcing. So I'm just gonna run through the objectives and we'll get going. Explain the role of environmental factors in the development of networks. That's really referring to monsoon winds, right? Monsoon winds, probably the one single most important thing. Explain the cause of the growth of the networks of exchange. So if you talk about Indian Ocean, you're talking about, kind of contextually, the Indian Ocean trade network was already well and established by the time 1200 gets there. But why does it grow so much in the 1400s? I think you could say that Pax Mongolica contextually is going to be part of that reason. It just intensifies, and increases interest in goods that are being exchanged in the Indian Ocean network. And then the effects, which we'll get to. All right, so let's just kind of get started with our daily 5, and today we're just going to do a single sourcing activity because this takes a few minutes to do. So let's kind of just look at this. So we're going to be asked to source one document, not the map. I added the map in here because we're going to be talking about Gujarat, and just a visual if that helps you out. Right? So going to be asked to source, and so when we're talking about sourcing, HIP is our acronym. You got to do one of those things. So let me just kind of throw this in here. Just a couple little things to remember, right, about sourcing. And we've already talked about this a decent amount, but let me just kind of remind you. Right, so you've got your HIP. All right, so HIPP, and there's the kind of explanation. So, this is small, right? Small c contextualization, right? So contextualization that, directly connected to the document, right? So intended audience, purpose, point of view, right? So what are the limitations? All right, so what you need to do when you're sourcing is really kind of select one of these. Right? Select one, really take one sentence to fully develop one of these 4 things. So when you're being asked to source, you don't need to do any more than one, right? Any more than one. Plus the so what, right? Plus the so what. All right, so that's what you're doing. So this really can also be done in one sentence. It's really hard to earn sourcing credit with less than 2 sentences. But if you do it right, you don't need more than 2 sentences. All right, so we're really kind of looking for 2 sentences here. All right, so with that all being said, let's go ahead and look at the document. All right, so here's our document. There is no doubt that the Gujaratis from the northwest coast of India are men who understand merchandise. They are also diligent, quick men in trade. They do their accounts with numbers like ours. There is also merchants from Egypt settled in Gujarat, as well as many merchants from Persia and the Arabian Peninsula, all of whom do a great trade in the seaport towns of Gujarat. Those of our people who want to be clerks and traders ought to go there and learn, because the business of trade is a science in itself. Source, Tomé Pierce, Portuguese merchant. This is from a book from 1515. So, source this document in one way. I would encourage you to pause the video, read through this, and give it an honest try, and then we'll go over some possible answers. Okay, so this is what we did in class. About 5 minutes, And students wrote 1 to 2 sentences trying to source this. All right. So hopefully you've taken a few minutes and kind of given this a go. All right. And so let's kind of look at this. What are some ways that you can contextualize this? All right. What are some ways you can contextualize this? Well, first off, if I want to, and I guess I will kind of give you a couple things, right? So what are some ways you could source this is probably what I should be saying. All right, and then we're going to start with contextualization. So we have a document from 1515. We have a Portuguese merchant. So if I want to contextualize this document, one simple way I could do this is, I mean, yes, this is talking about Gujarat, so I guess there's a couple of ways I could contextualize this. One is I could talk about, Portuguese merchant and trade. I could talk about the fact that, Muslim, diasporic, merchant, communities, date back in Gujarat, going back as far as, really the 600s, all right? Very early on, I think it's in the 630s, you see your first Muslim merchants, moving into this region from the Arabian Peninsula. So from the 600s, we are seeing this. All right. So that's kind of one angle you can kind of look at, is kind of look at those merchant diasporic communities. You could also contextualize this by looking at the kind of Portuguese connection, P-O-R-T, right? Portuguese. You could talk about Vasco da Gama, right? So, Vasco da Gama leaves in 1497, is when he leaves Portugal. So we're talking, what are we talking about here? Somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 years, kind of post da Gama. And that kind of original direct contact made between the Portuguese. All right. Let's kind of just put contact there. So what do we, so that's, so we're seeing at this point, much more kind of activity. Right, so that's kind of a couple angles you could look contextually is, you can kind of see that trade. And then how would I so what these kinds of things, what if you notice here that kind of reference to, they do their account with numbers like ours, right? So what is that referencing? That's referencing the Hindu Arabic numerals, right? The Hindu Arabic numerals or the Guptan numerals. That's a reference to that. If you don't know what that means, it looks like this. Okay. All right. So there's kind of a reference to that, and you kind of give your so what on this one. Maybe you could talk about just there's by within 15 years, kind of so what is you've got an increased level of merchant activity to the point where you already actually have a fight going on between the Portuguese and the Omani. So there's so much Portuguese activity, within this 15-year period that you're already seeing merchant conflicts between the Omani or the Muscat from Omani, the Omani Muscat, which is kind of on the mouth of that Strait of Hormuz, right? That kind of region where the Strait of Hormuz is. So you're already seeing conflict taking place kind of within that. So making that connection that this is a Portuguese merchant and we are years, a little over a decade after that would be a good way to do that. As far as audience, right? Who is the intended audience here? I think the intended audience, you could safely say, are Portuguese merchant families. Right? These are Portuguese merchant families, and that's who this is written for. And you could just kind of say why you would, why you kind of say that, and then like, what's the so what of this, right? What is the so what of this? And I think this kind of bleeds into, into the purpose, right? And you'll often, I see this a lot when I see sourcing and writing, is you'll often see somebody kind of start the sourcing one way, but then they give the so what, and it gives another one of these, and that's perfectly fine. That's not abnormal at all. So if the intended audience is for, to try to encourage Portuguese merchant families to establish a presence in the trading cities on the northwest coast of South Asia, if that's who your intended audience is, what is the purpose there? To establish Portuguese diasporic merchant communities. Right, that's the purpose of this. And there's an actual completely different word when we start talking about this for the Portuguese. We don't really call them Portuguese diasporic merchant communities. We use Strayer as our primary text, and he uses this phrase, trade post empire. All right. What we are seeing here is an early call to establish a trade post empire. You need a physical presence on the ground, right, in these places. So that's a couple of ways that you could have sourced this. Okay, all right. So that's what we started in class. So that's what we did in class today. And then after that, that took a fair amount of time today. So I just kind of threw on some things that we just talked about. All right, let's just kind of hit a couple of majors here, right? So, in this, I guess I'll kind of put this on because I do kind of throw this on the board real quick. When we're talking about Indian Ocean trade, right? Indian Ocean trade, or as John Green likes to say, and I really like this, the monsoon. Right, the monsoon marketplace. Central Asia has the Silk Road. Why don't we have something catchy for for this? In his crash course on this topic, he gives a bunch of options. This is easily my favorite. Make sure you are able to, make sure you're able to identify the goods. And if you watch that John Green, it really covers all of these things. The technological innovations. Right, the technological innovations that are being diffused, and of course, the ideas that are being thrown out, merchant ideas and the such, and I'll kind of go through those in a minute. This is really, really important. In your homework from last night, that Southernization article, on the Indian Ocean, that part of it. It's so important. If you really get this topic, then this will provide you contextualization for, 80-90% of the possible essays, essay topics from unit, for unit 3 and 4 coming up. It's such a big deal, right? That you kind of understand the kind of goods that were being exchanged in this network, how that is being intensified as the Silk Road intensifies, demand for goods intensifies on the periphery, and it's so important that you kind of get the kind of goods that are moving across, the kind of technological innovations that are happening, right? Because these technological innovations are going to be improved upon, right? So know what they are, know where they originate, know which ones are improved upon, and of course, because these are going to eventually make their way to Sangre in Portugal. And Prince Henry, and that whole story of exploration. So if you ever have an essay topic about the Portuguese or the Spanish or anything having to do with exploration, this is natural contextualization. So make sure you really kind of get this kind of stuff, right? There's your Lateen sails, right? So, yeah, really, really, really important. All right. So I kind of just emphasized that in class today. I did stop, kind of hold the brakes on everything. We watched a little John Green clip. He talks about these states and how trade, the role of trade, and how that is evolving during this period. Super important, and of course, we did take a minute and kind of just talk about these guys a little bit. There are a handful of travelers that you're expected to be aware of from this time period. One of which I don't really talk that much about in class, but I'll try to upload something on the classroom about about Marjorie Kemp. Right, and then there's Ibn Battuta, right? So Ibn Battuta, we'll talk about him in a day or two when we talk about Mali. Ibn Battuta, when it comes to travelers, is kind of easily the greatest traveler of this time period. Moroccan, right? So from North Africa, he'll travel across, throughout Central Asia, go by boat to China, do multiple excursions in and around the Indian Ocean. And of course, we'll look at him when we do West Africa because he crosses the Sahara and goes to Mali. And so Ibn Battuta is super important because we get so much of our historical accounts of places like on the Swahili city states like Kilwa from people like him, right? So he's super important. We did talk about Marco Polo in class a little bit. We watched a couple of film clips that I have, and if you look. Just kind of show you where they are, I guess. So I guess the John Green clip. If you just kind of scroll down, we watched the Yuan clip 1 and 2 today in class. Just to kind of look at Marco Polo. Right, so he will, his stories it's an amazingly interesting story. His dad and his uncle had walked across the Silk Road and back, and then went a second time and picked up young Marco at 18. And they make that journey. And then the film, those little clips there are from a Netflix series called Marco Polo. And this is, Marco, leaves Venice around the age of 18. So that story picks up when he's probably around 2021 or so. And kind of just shows you how he gets into the court of Kublai Khan. Right, spends 19 years in service of the great Khan, right, in service of Kublai Khan. Of the Yuan dynasty, right? You really need to know Kublai Khan, Yuan dynasty. That's from your homework from yesterday. And then he will be released from service, and then he will sail through the Malaccan Straits, and he actually has an official job. He is escorting, one of Kublai Khan's daughters for an arranged marriage, and she will then be delivered, and then he will walk back to Venice, right? And of course, the story of him is. Doesn't end there, right? So, but that's kind of for a later story, or you can, ask if you want, right? So there's that. But we did spend just a minute on Zheng He as well, right? So the story of Zheng He, it's kind of another one of these interesting stories, from this time period. So let me just kind of pause on this and look this over, and then we'll move on to Zheng He. All right. So real quick, Zheng He. What do you really need to know about him? He sails for who we always refer to him as the Yongle Emperor. Right. This is the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He'll rule from 1402 to 1424, and so Zheng He's voyages will kind of start, shortly after he becomes the emperor, and then we'll go on until Zheng He's death, kind of beyond the emperor. So when we talk about Zheng He, there are 7 separate voyages. They have purposes, right? One is to kind of end piracy or combat piracy here in the Malaccan Straits in Southeast Asia, so that kind of more safer trade for Chinese merchants and that are connected by these Chinese diasporic merchant communities, right? But the major purpose here is tribute missions, right? So we're seeing the kind of exchanging of goods, displaying of kind of power and dominance. These are not missions of exploration. This is a trade network that had been traversed for, at this point, a solid 2,000 years. And so this is not exploration. All right. When we talk about it, you should also kind of be aware of scale, right? So when we talk about his treasure fleet, or you read about his treasure fleet, these are massive fleets, right? Massive fleets. You'll often see comparisons with like Columbus's ships, right? So Zheng He's treasure ships, compared to what Columbus came across. Columbus has a couple of hundred people. You'll often see references to like 25 to 30,000 people on these voyages, right? Massive, massive voyages, and the kind of things that they bring across. This is probably one of the more famous ones is they'll bring giraffe to back to China. It's always my favorite kind of thing that comes back across there, right? So when you're talking about this, when you're talking about Zheng He, these are massive missions, where kind of huge outflows of silk and porcelain are being simply given away, and in exchange they're getting pretty some exotic stuff, right? And you can kind of see how far they traversed, and of course this always brings up one of the great historical what ifs. You've got state-sponsored missions here that are running, and then for whatever reason, when Zheng He dies in 1433, it all just comes to an end. It ends this state-sponsored missions, and the treasure ships, right? These massive, massive fleets, they are dismantled. They're taken apart. And this is not to say that China during the Ming era becomes isolationist, because they do not. They allow, very open trade with the outside world. They will come to restrict that in the 1500s, but they allow trade, to occur. So they don't become isolationist necessarily, but they stop these outward government tribute missions. And and it's at this point you start to see some kind of internal building taking place, so that the Great Wall, kind of on this northern frontier, kind of starting outside of Beijing. That Ming era building begins at this point. You also see the construction of the Forbidden City, and so there are some major building that takes place during the years after this. All right, but it does bring up one of those great historical what ifs. What if they hadn't done that? What if they, following Zheng He, his death, or maybe if he hadn't died, what if they had decided to start moving to the east and doing some actual exploration? What if they decided to do that? The ships were obviously capable of trans-Pacific travel. So they had the technology, to do so. So they had the technology, they had the ships. What if in the 1430s or 40s, you would have started to see Chinese colonization, starting to take place on the west coast of the Americas? It is one of these kind of great historical what ifs. So, but that's really all it is a what if. So, all right. So that's all for today. So what are some kind of takeaways? Trade gives rise to to new states, So the Swahili city-states, the Sultanate of Malacca. Trade will give rise to these in population and in prominence. Muslim diasporic merchant communities, have increased in prominence by the time we get to the end of our time period. But also you're seeing Chinese merchant diasporic communities as well. And of course, make sure you know your tech. Make sure you know your technological innovations that is bouncing around the Indian Ocean. So, and also you should have an idea of where it comes from, right? So the Astrolabe, created by the Greeks, improved upon, right, by Muslims, right? Compass, Chinese. Sternpost rudder, Chinese. Lateen sail. This has been in the Indian Ocean for 3,000 years at this point. So, kind of make sure you know what they are, what they do, right, in their story. And of course, our new ideas, right? So as merchant activity increases, so do innovations in order to, in order to increase it and improve it. All right, that is all for today. Sapriati.